"No, lawyer. You're finished," my brother grinned, as he said it loud enough for the entire courtroom to hear. A few people chuckled. My father smiled. Their attorney leaned back in his chair with the confidence of a man who had already decided how the day would end. I stood alone at the defense table. No lawyer, no family beside me, no one whispering encouragement in my ear. Then the judge opened a thick folder and stared at the first page. His expression changed. The courtroom grew quiet. He turned another page and another. Suddenly, their attorney stood up. "What is it?" my brother asked with a grin. The man didn't answer. Instead, he looked directly at me. His face had gone pale. "Oh my God." The words slipped out before he could stop them. My father frowned. "What?" The attorney swallowed hard. "Look at her file." The judge slowly removed his glasses. Then he said the sentence that would dismantle everything my family believed about me. "She doesn't need a lawyer." 5 seconds later, my father's body collapsed toward the floor. But to understand why that happened, you need to understand what kind of family I came from. My name is Nora Wells. I was 32 years old, and I had spent the last 6 months quietly building the thing that would end them. Growing up in the Wells house meant learning one rule before you learned anything else, not through words, not through a conversation anyone ever sat you down for. You absorbed it the way you absorb everything in a household, built on unspoken agreements. Derek mattered. I was the extra. When Derek got a C on a test, my father said school just wasn't for everyone. When I brought home an A-, the question was always the same. Why wasn't it an A? My father wasn't cruel in the way people usually picture cruelty. He never raised his voice. He never threw things. What he did was quieter than that, and it lasted longer. Derek needed him, needed his approval, his money, his rescue, every time something fell apart. And my father read that neediness as devotion. In his mind, the child who stayed dependent was the child who loved him. When I left at 18 and started building a life that didn't require his approval, he didn't see strength. He saw rejection. And he never forgave me for it. He never put that logic into words. But it sat behind everything, shaping every smile he gave Derek and every silence he gave me. The one person in that family who looked at me without that filter was my grandfather, Colonel Raymond Wells, retired Army, a man who said more through stillness than most people managed in a full conversation. When I was 13, he found me sitting alone behind his garage after my father had spent 20 minutes explaining why Derek deserved a new truck. Grandpa Ray sat down beside me and handed me a bottle of root beer. We didn't speak for a while. Then he said, "You know why they're wrong about you? They're measuring you with the wrong ruler." That sentence didn't fix anything, but it named the problem correctly for the first time, and that was enough to keep me moving. At 18, I enlisted. My father's response came immediately. "You'll quit in 6 months. You don't belong there." Grandpa Ray stood up from the kitchen table without any urgency and looked at him. "Funny. You said the same thing about me." My father had no answer. It was the only time I ever watched him lose an argument and know it. The Army gave me a decade of proof. Promotions, commendations, federal assignments. A record built entirely on what I could do, not whose daughter I happened to be. My father acknowledged none of it. When I made officer, he changed the subject. When I bought my first house, he asked why I wasn't married yet. Then Grandpa Ray had a stroke. I drove straight to the hospital, sat beside his bed for hours. At one point, he squeezed my hand and said, "Still carrying the family on your back." I laughed through something that wasn't entirely laughter. He smiled. Good. That was the last real conversation we ever had. 2 weeks after the funeral, we gathered for the will reading. Grandpa Ray's estate had been built the way he lived, without shortcuts, without fanfare. 2 paid-off properties. A stock portfolio he had been building since the 1970s, adding to it every year with the patience of a man who understood compound interest, the way he understood everything else, slowly and on purpose. The estate attorney placed the appraisal figure on the table, $1.85 million. Not a lottery, not inherited wealth. 40 years of small, careful decisions by a man who understood that money, managed right, becomes time and time, given freely, becomes love. Every cent of it went to me. Derek actually laughed. He assumed it was a clerical mistake. Then the attorney repeated himself, and the laugh died somewhere in Derek's throat. My father's face moved from red to something colder and more deliberate. He pointed at me. "You manipulated him." I looked at him steadily. "You don't actually believe that." But he did. That was the part that knocked the air out of the room. He genuinely believed it, because he couldn't construct a picture in his mind where someone spends years investing time and care in a relationship without expecting something in return. Devotion without a ledger made no sense to him. So he looked at every Sunday phone call, every hospital visit, every hour I'd spent with Grandpa Ray, and he filed it under strategy. He called it fraud, because manipulation was the only word he had for love he couldn't explain. He was wrong about everything. He meant every word. 3 weeks later, they filed the lawsuit. When I informed the court I'd be representing myself, the news reached the plaintiff's side in about 30 seconds. Harmon took it professionally, told me self-representation was certainly my right. Derek received it as confirmation they had already won. The morning of the first day, I arrived early. Old habit. In the army, on time meant early, and late meant you'd already failed. I organized my folders at the defense table and kept my eyes on my work. When Derek came through the hallway outside courtroom 3, he spotted me immediately. He walked over slowly, close enough that 2 passing clerks turned their heads. "No lawyer." He shook his head with a measured smile. "You're finished." My father was standing 3 feet behind his son. He said nothing. He smiled. Not a nervous smile, not the uncomfortable kind a person produces when they don't know what else to do. This was considered, in silence and with full awareness, the smile of a man watching his son perform exactly the way he had hoped. Gerald had the power to say, "Stop." He had the power to say her name, to put one hand on Derek's arm, to do anything at all. Instead, he arranged his face into approval and called it silence. That smile communicated everything he had never once put into words. "This is correct. This is what she deserves." I had been watching that smile my whole life. Behind it were 30 years of the same choice, made the same way in silence, and without apology. I turned back to my folders. Day 1 went exactly the way Derek had planned. Harmon was good, genuinely skilled. He didn't challenge Grandpa Ray's mental state directly, which would have been difficult to prove against a man with years of documented clarity. Instead, he built something subtler, an atmosphere. Nora visited often. Nora called constantly. Nora was close. He never said the word manipulation aloud. He didn't need to. Each witness placed one careful brick, and the gallery absorbed it without resistance. During recess, Derek was practically bouncing on his heels. He leaned toward my father and said, "She brought nothing. We've already won." Several people standing nearby heard him. So did I, from a bench by the window. I opened my water bottle and went back to my notes. Harmon's closing statement for day 1 was a masterpiece of implication. He gestured toward me at the defense table alone, no attorney, no professional beside me, and let the image carry his argument. The primary beneficiary of a $1.85 million estate sits at that table. No legal counsel, no independent verification of her claims. He spread his hands wide. The gallery read the gesture the way he intended. This is already settled. As Harmon sat down, Derek caught my eye across the aisle. The grin returned slow and certain. He mouthed 2 words. "You're finished." Neither he nor my father noticed the judge at that moment, because Judge Caldwell wasn't looking at me. He was looking down at the case file beside his bench, turning a page with care, and something in his expression had shifted entirely. Day 2, Judge Caldwell walked in carrying 2 folders. The day before there had been 1. Today the second was thick, tabbed along the edges with color. Annotated. The bearing of a document that had been read recently and read with attention. The moment it landed on the bench, my chest tightened. Not from fear, from recognition. I had filed it myself. 2 weeks before the trial, during pre-trial discovery, I submitted my complete military personnel record as a self-authenticating exhibit notarized, organized by category, delivered to the clerk's office, and to opposing counsel on the same day. Harmon's team received their copy the morning I filed. I watched him at the initial conference flip to the first page. Army officer, commendations, legal training, and set it down. He never picked it up again. I had counted on that. The file had been sitting in the case record for 2 weeks, available to anyone willing to read it. Judge Caldwell had been willing. Last night, by the look of those tabs, he had read all of it. Harmon opened with a prepared motion. 15 minutes, precise and controlled, every sentence reinforcing the same position. When he finished, the judge turned toward me. I stood. No notes. I addressed each point directly and sat back down. Harmon looked comfortable. Derek looked like a man watching something foregone. My father leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone who had already spent the inheritance in his head. Then the judge began turning pages of the second folder. 30 seconds passed, then 60, then 90. He removed his glasses. Mr. Harmon. Harmon stood. Yes, Your Honor. What is your position on Miss Wells's ability to represent herself? I believe self-representation places her at a significant disadvantage. The judge nodded once, opened the file. The sound of each turning page was the only sound in the room. She possesses extensive legal training. Page. She has completed advanced military legal education. Page. She has participated in federal investigations involving financial misconduct. Page. She has testified under oath in numerous official proceedings. He looked directly at Harmon. She doesn't need a lawyer. Harmon reached for his own copy, the one his team had received weeks earlier, and shelved. His eyes moved across it rapidly, then slowed, then stopped. The color left his face in a way that was almost physical. Oh my God. He hadn't planned to say it. The words simply came out. Derek turned. What? What is it? No answer. Harmon looked at Derek, then at me, then back at the page in his hands. Look at her record. My father leaned forward, confused. Then something moved behind his eyes. The very beginning of a story he had been telling about his daughter for 30 years, starting to come apart at the edges. The proceedings continued. The room, however, had changed. People stopped looking at me, like someone to pity. They started looking at me the way you look at something you should have anticipated and somehow missed entirely. Derek was no longer leaning back. The first witness called for cross-examination was Mrs. Reynolds. The previous day, she had told the court that Grandpa Ray had seemed unsettled following my visits. The implication had landed exactly the way Harmon intended it to. I approached without notes. You gave us specific dates yesterday. Dates when you claim my grandfather discussed changing his will after my visits increased. She confirmed it. I opened a folder and handed a document to the bailiff. Military travel orders. Official records, stamped and certified. On every single date she had mentioned, I was deployed overseas, thousands of miles away, not visiting anyone. She stared at the paper, her mouth opened slightly. I must have remembered wrong. You must have. A low murmur moved through the gallery. Derek's posture stiffened. He stopped leaning. Next, security footage from the assisted living facility appeared on the courtroom screen obtained months earlier through civil discovery. Grandpa Ray walked those hallways steadily, greeted staff members by name, corrected an entry in a document a nurse handed him, asked questions, made decisions. 20 minutes of footage. Nothing in any of it resembled the frail, confused man Derek's witnesses had described. The story they had built collapsed frame by frame, right in front of the people who had constructed it. Then came the financial records. 8 years of them, laid out in chronological order. A restaurant Derek opened in 2016 and shut down within the year. A limited liability company dissolved in 2018. A commercial lease defaulted in 2020. Every failure Grandpa Ray had covered. 7 documented transfers. $340,000 in total. Almost none of it ever repaid. The gallery went completely still. Would either plaintiff like to dispute these documents? Neither spoke. The records came directly from the financial institutions. There was nothing to dispute. Then I moved to introduce the emails. Harmon was on his feet immediately, objecting to relevance and context. For just a moment, 4 seconds, maybe 5, Derek's face relaxed into the edge of a smile. thin, controlled. I placed the Discovery production record on the evidence table. Harmon's own team had issued these documents under a case number and production stamp 4 weeks before trial. The judge reviewed the record and overruled the objection. Derek's almost smile was gone. His own words filled the screen. "He can't leave that money to Nora. You need to talk to him again. If he changes his mind, we're screwed." The courtroom read them in silence. My father stared at the table in front of him. Next came Gerald's pre-death transfers. In the 6 months following Grandpa Ray's diagnosis, 4 payments totaling $180,000 had moved into an account in my father's name. Each one labeled on the bank records as a personal gift. Each one executed after the will had already been revised. Under the Uniform Voidable Transactions Act, transfers made within 4 years of death, with the intent to reduce a beneficiary's share, are recoverable. The money wasn't gone, it was waiting. The judge's jaw tightened as he reviewed the documents. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Harmon made one final objection when I submitted the audio recording. "Hearsay," he argued. I presented the facility's session log, showing Grandpa Ray had recorded it himself, on his own device, with staff present, and the session formally logged. The judge reviewed the authentication documentation. Overruled. The recording played. His voice came through the speakers, older than I remembered, softer around the edges, but unmistakably him. "If anyone deserves it, Nora does." Nobody moved. She never asked me for anything. She never treated me like a bank account. Then the last line. She loved me before she knew what I owned. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It carried something the room would take with it long after everyone left. Judge Caldwell turned to Harmon. "Do you wish to continue arguing undue influence?" Harmon looked at the emails on screen, at the footage, at the financial records, at Derek and Gerald, neither of whom could lift their eyes to meet anyone else's. "No, Your Honor." 3 words from their own attorney. They landed harder than any verdict could have. I closed my folder, picked up my briefcase. As I passed the plaintiff's table, I leaned in just slightly enough for Derek and the first row of the gallery to hear. "Finished looks like this." Then I walked out. Judge Caldwell's ruling came without ceremony. The will of Colonel Raymond Wells stood, fully valid and enforceable. The petition was denied in its entirety. Court costs were awarded against the plaintiffs. Gerald's 4 payments, totaling $180,000, were referred for further review under the Uniform Voidable Transactions Act. As primary beneficiary, I had legal standing to pursue a civil recovery action. That money wasn't protected. It was simply waiting for the next step. Gerald collapsed before he made it out of the building. A cardiac event, stress-induced, the physicians said, choosing their words with professional care. Everyone in that room understood what they meant. He spent 4 days in the hospital. Derek handled the discharge paperwork. That detail struck me as strangely ironic. The son, who had spent a lifetime being rescued, was now the one filling out the forms. I didn't visit. I thought about it once, standing in a parking lot 2 days after the ruling. Then I thought about that smile in the hallway outside courtroom 3, and the thought passed. Some silences aren't cruelty, they're conclusions. I heard he went home through someone who heard it from someone else. I didn't ask for anything beyond that. I heard later that Harmon returned the retainer. He told Derek and Gerald he could no longer serve as their representative and referred them elsewhere. Whether another firm picked up the case, I couldn't say. By that point, it didn't change much. Outside the courthouse on the day of the ruling, the afternoon light sat low over the parking lot. There was no urge to celebrate. Something that had been running for a very long time had stopped, and the feeling was closer to stillness than triumph. 3 weeks passed. Derek found me near my apartment. Soft voice, measured posture. I think we both said things we didn't mean. Family is family. I recognized it for exactly what it was. I nodded once and drove home without another word. 8 days after that, he showed up at the assisted living facility. He asked the front desk for the box of Grandpa Ray's personal letters, claiming he was there on my behalf. He brought a handwritten note on plain paper. No letterhead, no power of attorney. No notarized authorization. The facility manager asked for proper documentation. Derek said it was a family matter. The manager asked him to wait, stepped away, and called the number listed on the litigation hold notice filed the day. Judge Caldwell referred Gerald's transfers for investigation, instructing the facility to preserve every document connected to Grandpa Ray's estate. That number rang my phone. I drove over and retrieved the box. Inside was a handwritten letter, addressed to me by name, dated 6 months before Grandpa Ray died. I read it once in the front seat of my car in the parking lot. Then I forwarded it, along with the visitor log bearing Derek's signature and a recording of his request at the front desk, to the body handling Gerald's asset investigation. Derek had come to erase the final piece of evidence. Instead, he handed investigators a documented attempt to interfere with an active case. The lawsuit he filed to take everything from me had produced the discovery materials that exposed him. The reconciliation he offered delivered the closing piece. Every trap in this story he constructed himself. Every tool he placed in my hands. He called it family. In every sense that mattered, it was over. The legal process doesn't resolve itself the way stories do on television. There's no single moment where everything settles at once. It moves in stages, through referrals and filings and phone calls from people you've never met in person. But here is what eventually happened, and I'm going to be specific, because vague endings serve no one. The civil recovery action under the Uniform Voidable Transactions Act moved forward. The court ordered the return of the $180,000 Gerald had transferred out of the estate following Grandpa Ray's diagnosis. The court also assessed costs against the plaintiffs, the equivalent of what competent legal counsel would have charged, totaling $42,000. Gerald's finances, already under pressure, absorbed a blow he had no quiet way to manage. Derek's interference at the facility was referred for criminal review. 6 months after the trial, he entered a plea agreement on a charge of interference with legal process. $15,000 in fines. 2 years of supervised probation. No prison time, but a permanent record. In a community where people pay attention, that record carries its own weight. People who had known the Wells family for years, neighbors who had attended the same gatherings and said nothing when things were wrong, found ways to say something now. Some reached out to me. Others simply stopped returning Derek's calls. A reputation, once it begins to shift, rarely shifts back. Months passed. A message came through one afternoon from a number I didn't immediately recognize. It took a moment to place it as Derek's new phone. He said he had been doing a lot of thinking. That family was family regardless of what had happened between people. That he hoped I was doing well, and that maybe someday we could sit down and talk. I read it once, put my phone face down on the table, and went back to what I was doing. I didn't reply that day, or the one after. At some point, the thought of replying simply stopped occurring to me. Not out of anger. Anger would have meant I was still invested. It was quieter than that. The absence of any reason to reopen a door I had closed deliberately and for good reason. The life I have now is smaller than the one I used to imagine when I was young, and better in every way that actually matters. People around me who don't require me to make myself smaller before they're comfortable. Colleagues who read my record and treat it as a beginning rather than a threat. A friend who calls on Sunday mornings not to ask for anything, just to talk. These things sound ordinary. They are ordinary. That is precisely what makes them what they are. Now I want to speak to you directly, because the story is finished, but the point of it isn't. Derek was not simply a cruel person. He was a performance, running continuously for one audience. Every taunt in that hallway, every smirk at the defense table, every email, every parking lot approach dressed up in the word family, all of it was produced for my father. Derek spent his entire life being Gerald's evidence that Gerald had made the right choices, loved the right child, and invested in the right future. When I won, what broke wasn't just a lawsuit. It was the story my father had been telling himself about who he was. And that smile in the hallway, the one Gerald gave Derek before the trial began. I want to be precise about what it was, because I spent years calling it weakness, and that word is far too generous. It was a vote, cast deliberately, with full awareness, in favor of the person causing the harm. 30 years of the same vote, rendered the same way in silence, and without a trace of doubt. That smile told me everything Gerald had never once said aloud. This is correct. This is what she deserves. Every time Derek hurt me and Gerald said nothing, he wasn't standing aside. He was participating. Here is the first thing I want you to hold on to. Silence is not a neutral position. When someone with the power to intervene chooses not to, that choice has a meaning. It says, I see what is happening, and I am not going to stop it. When that silence comes with a smile, it stops being passive and becomes something worse. It becomes permission. The people who stood by while you were diminished were not confused bystanders. They made a decision. You are not required to protect a relationship with someone who spent years choosing not to protect you. Call it what it was, a choice. Then, decide what you want to do with that knowledge. Here is the second thing. The most dangerous person in any room is the one nobody thought to take seriously. Derek's contempt for me wasn't just an ugly character trait. It was a strategic failure that cost him everything, because contempt requires you to stop looking. The moment someone stops looking is the moment you have all the room you need. I submitted my personnel record to the case file 4 weeks before trial. Harmon received a copy the same morning. He glanced at the first page and set it down, because he had already decided what I was. That document sat available in his possession, unread, while I built the argument that dismantled his case entirely. He wasn't unintelligent. He was incurious. In this situation, the two produced identical results. If someone is underestimating you right now, use it. Don't argue. Don't explain yourself to people who have already written their conclusion. Build something in the space their dismissal has opened up. What you construct without an audience watching tends to be the most enduring thing you ever make, because it was built on your terms, without permission, and without anyone paying close enough attention to interfere. And the third thing, the one that holds all the others in place. The sentence that mattered most in that courtroom was not the judge's ruling. It wasn't Harmon's concession. It wasn't Derek's silence when his own words appeared on a screen in front of the people he had spent years performing for. It was an old man's voice, recorded 6 months before he died, filling a room he never entered. She loved me before she knew what I owned. He wasn't describing a transaction. He was describing what it looks like when someone pays attention to you for no reason other than that you matter to them. The people who missed that in me didn't diminish it. They simply missed it. Their failure of perception was not a statement about my value. It was a statement about the limits of their vision. That is the hardest lesson, because most people who have been told for years that they are not enough will eventually begin looking for proof of their worth in the faces of the very people who have already decided they don't matter. They return to the same rulers and wonder why the measurement keeps coming back wrong. Stop returning. The grandfather who sees you is more accurate than the father who doesn't. The institution that advances you on merit is more honest than the family that dismissed you on tradition. The record that held up in a courtroom carries more truth than the story told about you at every dinner table. You are already what they refuse to see. You always were. The only question is whether you build your life inside their verdict or somewhere entirely beyond their reach. If this story found you today, leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Tell me yours, because the most important thing about stories like this isn't that they're rare. It's that they're not. If stories about people who build something solid in the silence of being underestimated matter to you, subscribe. The next one is already waiting.